Hi everyone, welcome back to Novel Nomad and welcome to another Top 5 Wednesday. I think this is my first one for 2019, but today is going to be quite interesting because the topic is independent women. Women who can still get shit done and not be influenced by any external sources and love interest, which I find a thoroughly fascinating topic. I was a bit strict with this one because even with love interests who say get married, there's still a little bit of tension there. So I did one that's strictly that they remain independent and they remain to have their own agency within the story. So absolutely starting off, we've got Hale, which she's from Behind the Throne series by KB Wages. This is such a great fantasy series that has Indian cultural background. So there's an incredibly strong matriarchy. So there's no longer a patriarchy, there's a matriarchy. But what I loved in this one is that it took the matriarchy to the next level. So basically men's lives are deemed as nothing. So I find it was very, very interesting to look into that concept. But what I found really fascinating about this one is the middle daughter of the Empress runs away to become a gunslinger as such, or gun runner I should say. So she goes into the world of crime. She's always wanted to get away, and she's just an incredibly powerful independent character, but she still has a lot of her own agency. Even though she was a gun runner, she had a romantic partner and a lot of what his counsel would serve to her, but she was still in charge and they gave her that power. And what I loved about this is that she doesn't abuse her power. So even though she does become, even though she was in a relationship, and even though when she's dragged back to the Empire, she's not technically in a relationship, but she has to start another relationship with another man, completely non-romantic, but she has to remain in power. She has to ensure that her agency and her power isn't being abused. And so I found that very interesting to have it from the women's perspective. So next we have the lovely Felicity from The Lady's Guide to Petticoats and Piracy. This another excellent read by Mackenzie Lee. But what I loved about Felicity is that she's asexual. She has no interest in having that sexual experience or that kind of attraction to another person. So that doesn't technically influence her decisions. So whilst it's not a romantic relationship, she does have a female friend who is not really a friend, but she still wants to be very close to, who she doesn't try to impress, but she tries to remain independent from, but still try to be with. It's a very confusing time. But even then, her absolutely wonderful friend Joanna is an incredibly independent woman in her own right, even though she likes all the frills and flounces and tea parties and all those amazing things. She wants to be her own person. She wants to be her own independent woman, and she has a desire to learn and study and just be who she wants to be. So these two women, one who doesn't have that kind of romantic drive and one who does but is not ready for it because she's so wanting to focus on her own self-development, I found were incredibly wonderfully modern characters for this tale. It is set in the 1700s, but it is perfect. Next we have one of my absolute favourite authors for writing very strong female characters within the teen genre, and that is Tamora Pierce, one of my absolute particular favourites. So it would have to be Trickster's Queen. This is in the Tricksters series, so not giving too much away, but Alana, who you meet in the first series, this is her daughter Ali. And she is quite incredibly strong character because she gets kidnapped and taken to these islands where slavery is still very much used and abused, and she becomes a house slave. But along the way she gets a romantic interest, but of course instead of hindering her or trying to take the power of her revolution, because she's never been house slave and she wants to have freedom for these people, in her efforts to coordinate this revolution, he helps her, much to her fear in the lack of almost power. So she herself had to relinquish a certain amount of power and dominance over him. So that I thought was a really good dynamic. They They both had their different strategies and their different ways of approaching each other, but they were always a team together, and they always worked to help one another. But ultimately, because she was the more experienced within the spy field, he definitely deferred to her on a lot of different things. So going back a little bit further, we have The Alice Network by Kate Quinn. What I love about this book, this is a historical fiction set between World War One and post-World War Two. So you start with Charlie Sinclair, who's looking for her lost cousin. She's very close to her cousin, and her cousin is French, and she's trying to find what happened to her cousin throughout the war. And on that trail, she enlists the help of Eve Gardner. And Eve Gardner was actually a female spy during the First World War. So you really look into Eve Gardner's life and what she did in the First World War. Now, some of her actions were motivated in want to impress a man who she was in love with, but was never really returning the feeling. But I really love Charlie. Charlie was a very strong, independent young woman who was breaking away from her father and her mother and breaking away from her family to try and discover what happened with her cousin, because there was just that acceptance that nothing could be done, and she was not accepting that. She would not take no for an answer. She wanted to find out the truth. So I thought this was an absolutely brilliant read. It was so good, and there is a romantic development that occurs later on with Charlie, but it's perfect. She still manages to move independently throughout the story, and considering it was like the late 40s going into the 50s, and when women's agency was once again trying to be reduced back after the war, it was just amazing to see that support from her male romance interest. And lastly, a classic that I wanted to get a bit of a mention in this tag, and that is definitely going to be The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. And of course I'm going to mention Helen, the pinnacle character of this story. Now, yes, it's written in the 1830s, and yes, it's set during that period as well, but it is focusing on women's lack of agency and women's lack of power after they get married. Helen is a very strong, independent woman who wants to have a lifestyle that she has, wants to have a lifestyle where she can express her passions. So of course she marries a man she's in love with, even though he's not right for her, even though he's not meeting her on matches of minds. He's just appealing to her vanity in a way, even though she expressed to not want that. He's still wooing her in that sense. So she's in fact taken in a way by this man, and it is her subtle resistance throughout their marriage of her refusing to allow him to get away with all this debauchery, and how he treats her, and how he starts treating her son, and how he treats the maids and other women in the household. So I think she's an incredibly powerful woman for the time, and whilst it's not quite in the league of what the other women did, because she did have to defer to the male power and the husband's power, and even her brother's power in the in society at the time, it was a very rare and powerful story of its era, because it was managed to show the injustices for women in marriage, but it also managed to show the power that women could hold if they could just take grasp and use their own agency. Okay, so that is Top 5 Wednesday for this week. I hope you all have a lovely time. Happy reading, and I'll see you next time. Bye!